Hello, and welcome to Gestalt IT. My name is Tom Hollingsworth. I am the Networking, Security, and Wireless Analyst here, and we just finished up Tech Field Day Virtual Cisco Live Experience over the month of June, and we had some exciting product announcements and technology discussions. We wanted to get some of our delegates back in front of the camera for a little bit of a roundtable. You know what these are. This is an opportunity for the smartest people in the room to be in a virtual conference room and kind of talk about some of the things that we learned about. So I want to take a quick moment for everybody here to introduce themselves with their name and their Twitter handle so that you can understand who they are before we get into the topics. Phil, go ahead.
Hey, my name is Phil Geruasi. I'm network_Phil on Twitter. And after all the smartest people were asked and none of them could make it, Tom asked me to join today. So it's good to be here. Thanks.
Thanks for the flexibility in your schedule, Phil.
Yeah.
Shala?
So I'm Shala. Most people know me across social media as Gifted Lane, and I'm excited to be here taking part. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. JD?
Hey folks, Jonathan Davis or JD here. You can find me on Twitter at subnetwork, and my blog is subnetwork.me.
All right. Thank you very much. John?
John Herbert, Mr. Tuggs on Twitter, also one of the not smartest people in the room, but pleased to be here. Thank you.
And Jody.
Hi, I'm Jody Lemoine at Ghost in the Net on Twitter, and it seems everybody else is saying that they were the last ones to be invited when everyone else couldn't make it, and I'm in the same boat. But I blog on ghostinthenet.info, and I will try to offer an intelligent opinion.
Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. So let's get into the topic for this roundtable discussion. So Cisco Live is the annual event where our fine friends over at Cisco make some new product announcements. And it felt a little different this year because everything had to be online due to, well, let's be honest, the way the world is kind of behaving right now. But one of the topic areas that there were some pretty interesting announcements that came out of is the intent-based networking group. Now, I'm sure you probably have heard the term intent-based networking several times in the past, especially if you're a friend of Field Day. It's come up quite a bit recently. But intent-based networking is the unit of Cisco now that focuses on enterprise solutions. So we got a great discussion around things like policy implementation, SD-WAN, user-defined networking, and DNA spaces. Now, I'm going to start it off with Phil because I know that Phil is not short when it comes to opinions. Phil, what did you think of some of the announcements that came out of here? Pick one of them and tell me kind of what your highlight area was.
Oh, well, it's hard to pick one. What I'm going to do is, well, I want to focus on the fact that I see a larger integration happening now. It's not that we're talking about IBN in the data center, right, or IBN in the campus, but the announcements kind of in total of how all of the parts of the network are now not necessarily being managed by one big controller, but we're kind of headed in that direction. That the intent of the business, whether that be policy or how the network is supposed to operate, whatever kind of function, it really translates to more than just the data center. And Cisco is now making those moves. And that's really interesting to me to see how now we're talking about the campus and the WAN, of course, in Cisco's case, Cisco SD-WAN, and the data center, and how that's all integrating together. And that's pretty, I think that's very compelling argument that they're making here. And wireless, I forgot about wireless too.
Yeah, I would say that one of the trends that I've seen recently is how to integrate the SD-WAN experience into the data center. Originally, it was just, hey, let's figure out how to run some broadband and some LTE connections at an edge router, and we'll figure something else out. And now we see it being used for cloud on-ramp. We see it being used for more and more growing remote access to cloud services. So there's a lot of excitement there. And in the presentation that we got from the group that was formerly Viptela and now Cisco SD-WAN, they were talking about a lot of really crazy data center use applications. And I'm a little excited to see where that ends up going, just because I think it gives us the possibility of extending our reach now that, we hear a lot of things that have come up recently, like, there's a very good possibility that work from home will be the primary mode of interaction with the cloud and data centers going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, the idea here is that we're focusing more on the application, we're focusing more on the end user, right? The user-defined network, that was a term that we heard last week, and that makes sense. And so that traffic isn't isolated to just the data center. Those resources live in the data center, but they transit the WAN, they transit the campus, they go over the air, they go over the wired network, and that application is the same no matter where it is. You want it to behave the same. You want the policy that that applies to the user or to the application to be the same and consistent. So it makes sense to see this overall integration among all of these areas of networking. So to have a business unit called IBN and sort of wrap their arms around all of these areas makes sense.
I would agree with you there. And I think that the holy grail of having unified policy is something that we really have been chasing for several years, clopping along with little coconuts, following after that magical thing that we all want. Now, JD, you're big in the wireless space, and we've started to see a lot of this starting to bleed over, where the idea of a wireless policy and a wired policy are more tightly integrated because users are doing different ways to connect now. What did you see from this presentation that really kind of gave you hope for the technology direction that Cisco's taking?
Well, I think you both really hit it on the head there. What we're talking about is we're talking about a unified policy, right, that's per user, per device, and per application. So we can really get granular and we can say, okay, this user's devices, these are the user devices, and they have a common policy. We can allow other users' devices to interact with these devices if we so choose, or if they so choose. We can kind of push some of that security delineation into those other areas, and allow the users to make those choices where that's the right, right for the organization. But really, the beautiful thing about this is that it is that I think we're finally at that point where we have an answer to BYOD, number one, and we have an answer to all of those additional devices that are now network connected, right? I feel like for the last several years, the network was still built for a laptop or a desktop. That was what we were really kind of building enterprise networks around. And the mobile phone and the iPad and any of those other devices that kind of get brought into the situation were still afterthoughts. And I think now we're finally at this place where, from an enterprise perspective, we have a common answer to all devices that the client may use, and we have an easy way of applying the policy to that.
Yeah, and I think that was a huge part of the user-defined networking presentation, where we were talking about the idea that you can effectively segment pieces of the network off from certain types of devices, from certain classes of devices, to provide more usability, but also to provide more security. I mean, I don't want Bonjour devices broadcasting far and wide. I don't want a Chromecast on every TV in the lobby suddenly wide open to whoever wants to stream inappropriate things at inappropriate times. But more importantly, I mean, this kind of works hand in hand with a lot of the security topics that we've seen, like microsegmentation. If you limit these down to the bare minimum of people necessary to make things operate, it really helps you in the long run.
Absolutely, and I think that microsegmentation is the thing that really struck me. Is we are talking about getting very finely grained access and control to these devices, and ultimately, I think it will make us all provide much more secure environments for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair though, a lot of this stuff has already existed. I've been installing ICE for years. ACI has been around for a while now, and so with the concept of SGTs and endpoint groups and all that stuff, I think what we're seeing here now is how all of this is starting to come together. Now, granted, when we start to talk about AI and ML and the improvement of Cisco to be able to identify endpoints and things like that, I get it. So there are some improvements there in the technology, but a lot of these things are kind of like the building blocks that have always kind of existed in silos that we're now seeing come together. Does that make sense? Am I off there?
Absolutely.
That's exactly what I was going to say as well. Is it's kind of like taking, what was seen in ACI that was almost a little bit abstract, where it may have felt a little bit manual, where I had to group the servers by purpose and by intent, and then saying, okay, well, how about I do an endpoint analysis automatically and identify these specific things, and then, but I'm now going to do that right down to the user endpoint. So rather than being in the data center, now I'm pushing that right out to the endpoints of the networks, down into switches on the user end of things, and now applying the same kinds of policies that we were talking about in ACI right throughout the network, right at the edge. Now starting to tie that in with, well, with the zero trust concepts as well, and saying, well, we can do your authentication at the edge as well, and have that policy extend and your authentication that goes with it. Now I can throw that extension right across the network too, and wrapping it up. And like you say, it's taking lots of pieces that have kind of almost been building for the last few years now, and saying, okay, now we can start joining them up and use these, as JD said, it's not like one, I think JD said, not like one big system, but it's putting together a number of systems and pulling that data together so you can actually start benefiting from the merger of that data in a way that you can start using that in a cohesive fashion.
Yeah, it sort of feels like, rather than buying lumber from a big box retailer and screws and everything else and sawing and cutting and assembling furniture, now we're just buying it from IKEA in a box and following the directions, right? It's a little bit more mature product, and we're buying a specific product right now, and we know what it's supposed to look like at the end, and we have directions and a clear product or a clear path to get there now.
The interesting thing about this, though, and it is bringing it all together, but I'm surprised that it's coming together as a product. With Cisco's move towards services over the last few years, and with everything going lighter and lighter on the on-premises installations, it really seems interesting that this is very tied to on-premises resources or data center resources, that there's really no option to move it to cloud services or to offer it as a service. And I'm quite surprised that's not how they came out of the gate.
Well, I mean, some of the components can be. You know, you can run a wireless controller, ICE, things like that.
ICE,
I mean, yeah. Well, okay, fair enough. But there's latency restrictions to running a DNA center appliance, where you need to have that on-prem or at least extremely good connectivity to it. But that's ultimately what it is. I think that's what it is. It's that there are still networking restraints or constraints that require that on-premises footprint. So like DNA Center, DNAC is the brain here. That's where all that policy is going to live, and that's what's going to tie those things together. And there's no DNA Center in the cloud, at least to the extent where you can run a full fabric. I know that there's a DNA cloud offering, mixed in there, but it's not fully functional yet. So.
Yeah, I think I speak for a lot of the community when I tell you that I'm about to call the emperor out for not having any clothes. Cisco has had a hard time in the past pulling these things together. Nobody out there will deny that. But I think importantly, kind of to the points that you've been making, this is not unlike Cisco finding out that they already have all the pieces that they need. They already have all the ingredients in the kitchen to make a really good meal. They just bought all the pieces for different things. And they're like, wait a minute, if we whip all this stuff up together and put a little spice on it, we can actually make this work the way we want. Because Cisco historically has exposed knobs and bells and whistles and given you all of the capabilities you could ever want. It's just making them all fit together nicely in a package that wasn't based around, I don't know, Cisco Works. And hopefully a whole bunch of people out there just cringed when they thought of Cisco Works. But ultimately, where does this lead? What is the end goal? Is this to just get everybody running on DNA Center and hopefully we can make it work? Or is there like something more directed? So kind of to JD's point about the IKEA thing, is it buying a bookcase for the sake of buying a bookcase? Or is it showing people beautiful pictures of how they can rearrange all the bookcases in their house to do something interesting to, I don't know, increase their quality of life?
I think that the long-term goal here is more abstraction. It's not necessarily exposing more nerd knobs and nerd levers and things like that. I mean, yeah, that's part of it. And DNA Center has them all in there. But ultimately, it's increasing the level of abstraction between the network operator and the network, and then relying on that business intent. That's the input into the DNA Center appliance and into that software. and then the translation occurs to push that out to the network appropriately. I mean, for example, when you deploy DNA Center in a full software-defined access fabric, you're not configuring ISIS manually or Lisp manually. Those things happen automatically. There's an automation engine built on APIC. APIC EM in this case. So I think we're going to see greater abstraction, which is a big part of the kind of the vendor agnostic definition of intent-based networking, that there is a layer of greater abstraction between the operator and the network. And then that abstraction allows you to start incorporating that continual validation to get that greater visibility into the network. That might lead to a better quality of life because you're more aware, you can feed that into your security tools, whatever else. And then have a more efficient network, a better running network, all the things that flow from greater visibility in those autonomous health checks. Does that make sense?
And there's also, and some of that, and I'm not sure if it's truly abstraction, but some of that taking away the detail while still having the nerd knobs. I'm going to say the machine learning word again. We were talking about, endpoint identification. One of the things that was being discussed in ICE was use of ML to intelligently try and make a guess as to what an endpoint is specifically, down to examples were given as, down to this is a Honeywell thermostat, right? Or this is a Bosch coffee machine on the network and this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And using, accumulated data and experience in order to determine what something is, using machine learning to make a more intelligent guess over time. And that's the kind of thing that as you learn to trust that system, that becomes an abstraction where you start to trust it to go, yeah, it probably made a pretty good guess over it. I don't need to worry about that anymore. Well, that's kind of what abstraction is, right? It's that you brush under the carpet. I don't need to worry anymore. It did it. It put it in the Bosch coffee machine group. I'm done. That's great. That just took something off my plate. I didn't need to worry now. I already have a coffee machine policy. I never thought I'd have one of those, but that's great.
And there's something to network automation that doesn't require you to do the automation yourself.
We never really wanted to.
No, we never did. We just do because we have to.
We wanted it to be automated, but this was the whole discussion at the beginning of network automation was if we wanted to be programmers, we would have been programmers in the first place.
Well, the other thing too
build
is
networks.
Right. Well, the other thing too is we also don't want to be lost in the minutia, right? If we look at a standard corporate environment and the number of clients that are there now and the types of applications that those clients are running, and especially when you tack on not only the applications, but any metrics or whatever they may also be, reporting out. And I mean, you're talking about, a thousand users will have 3,000 or 5,000 devices that have millions of ports and connections open and that they're accessing. And the reality is that it would take a small army to actually be able to police those and manage all of the security policy and everything else that's required to actually keep all of that healthy. And so what we need, that's the importance of that machine learning. That machine learning is about, covering the 80% so that we can focus on the 20% that actually needs our input and actually needs our hands-on to ensure that things are working.
Yeah, you're right, JD, because you know what? You can configure a lot of this stuff manually, like last year. You can configure TrustSec on your network manually. You can configure ISIS and Lisp manually. You can configure Campus Fabric. Remember Campus Fabric? That's what SDA is built on, So you could do it all manually. And now we've just, with the implementation of DNA Center and the intelligence that we're adding with machine learning and AI and all that buzzword bingo stuff, you've removed the 80%, like you said. And that's why I say that we're moving towards greater network abstraction, machine-to-machine automation. Can we say it that way? Where there's intelligence there based on, policy where the machines talk to each other, DNA Center instructs switches and things like that as to what to do with a port or what to do with particular application traffic going over the WAN. So yeah, that's kind of how I see the future of networking in general.
We manage the stuff that has to be managed, not the stuff that can just be left to automation.
Yeah.
Now, Shala, I want to give you a chance to jump in here because this was your first experience with Field Day, and we really appreciate you joining in. But you're coming at this from a slightly different perspective because you're still, I would say, early in your journey through networking. how does this look to you as someone who's not had to deal with the old school ATM lane and other craziness of the old days? You know, is this something that's exciting that helps you kind of worry about more important things than just sweating the small configuration pieces?
Exactly. So my mentor who helped me when I first started out getting into networking, I remember seeing his frustrations and our conversations where, you know, it was taking him the longest time to just get things done and figuring out like what devices were on the network and stuff like that. So for me, as someone coming in, you know, still new and still wrapping my head around it, it's all exciting because I have a huge love for IoT in the first place, and I like machine learning and all those kind of things. So for me, it's just, I'm looking forward to just getting my hands on it and then actually just helping implement it at my current job, because we're trying to deploy some of these things and just seeing how it all works. And I kind of feel like I'm fortunate to come in where we have these new products that are coming out. So it's going to be different for me than, you know, say how it was for my mentor. And I'm excited about it. I feel like it's going to be like smarter networking. I'm not sure, but I'm excited about it because I'm someone who makes like bots and stuff like that. So yeah.
Hey, can I ask what problems are you all trying to solve at your organization that you are looking at some of these things to implement?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it has to do with we're starting to work remotely a lot more, for one, and we're just trying to see, you know, how it's going to help us out in that front versus I think having so much stuff kind of like on-prem. I think we're doing like a heavy push of just going to the cloud period in general. And so I think that's just what we're figuring out. And right now I'm kind of fortunate where I get to shadow them and help them out. And I'm actively learning like what is Cisco SD-WAN and all that kind of stuff and trying to wrap my head around it. And right now my mind has already been blown just from the past 2 months of going through the different sandboxes and trying to piece it all together. And I was just like, wow, this is amazing.
I envy you, Shala, just because I have a head full of RIP and 802.11b, and I really wish that I didn't have to have that. It's filed in there with the netware directory commands. So yeah. One thing I want to talk about is DNA spaces. Specifically, I want to bring up DNA spaces because it relates to a lot of the greater global things that are going on. DNA spaces, the big announcement that we got from Cisco, it's a new version of the technology that's going to help identify devices, kind of like John alluded to, devices in your network, devices that are moving through. But we've seen a bigger impact from the social aspect of things, specifically around things like contact tracing. With the global pandemic, it's more important now than ever to be able to identify devices in your network, be able to pin those devices to people, be able to do contact tracing in the event that something happens. And if, depending on when you read this, you are either completely horrified by the news of what's going on, or you're hopeful that things are slightly getting better. I can't even begin to describe every day what that feels like waking up. But Cisco, and this is a main theme of Chuck Robbins' keynote, is trying to leverage technology to help these greater ideas that are out there. This isn't just building technology for the sake of making a cool, blinky, lighted gadget anymore. There's real, legitimate applications for all of this. So, JD, you're the expert here on wireless technologies, and you've had a lot to say about DNA spaces over the year. How does this impact you and kind of some of the work that you do, being able to have hyper accurate location data?
Well, I think you know what I'm happy to see. Number one is I would say a more refined view on where devices are and what's happening with those. It's a little bit of a pivot for this RTLS application, right? Contact tracing, when you when you start looking at it that way, it changes things from we're going to trace customers and we're going to trace visitors and figure out where they're at and where they're spending their time and what products are drawing them in repeatedly and things along those lines in a traditional, say, retail environment. So to now we have this view of the safety requirement of, are our employees staying safe? And if someone comes in, or if one of our employees gets sick, right, can we tell who has been in close contact with this employee for a period of time? And it's interesting because on one hand, it's a very useful feature, right? It's a feature that I think all of us in some ways would understand and respect the requirement for. But it's also a little frightening now, because what we are talking about is real-time monitoring of location, and I think a lot of it depends on how that data is floated up. As we've seen in other areas, right? Apple and Google, created, kind of jointly created this API that they could use for detecting what mobiles, people are close to based on BLE as well, separate from Wi-Fi, right? And in that instance, what we found is, number one, people are kind of scared of the technology. But when they tried to make that, to be very careful about the data that they were exposing, we saw governments and organizations or large governments push back on that because they wanted more in-depth data. So there's some questions there, and I think a lot of organizations are going to have to look inwardly to decide exactly how they're going to handle that. Is it a new HR policy that's going to be required, and how do they inform users of how that data is being used? Now, from swinging back that back around to the technical conversation, with the additional radios that are available in the new APs, specifically with the BLE capabilities, what we're talking about now is we're talking about going from several meters of tracking to a 1 or 2 meter tracking. Now we really can say, okay, yeah, this person was within 6 feet of this individual that we know is, positive for COVID or whatever whatever comes in 2022, right? Or whatever virus, makes us all into zombies. We can actually start getting into some real clarity, rather than saying this person was in the same floor and building quadrant as this other individual now, right? So the data itself, the resolution of the data becomes good enough that it's usable, and that's really the important part of this.
Yeah, you definitely open up some very challenging ethical and moral questions when you start identifying people. So this kind of technology has been able to do like occupancy tracking, and you've been able to get quite granular, and that granularity is definitely improving. But you've been able to kind of anonymize the data without losing the information about how many people are in a space. Well, now, obviously, as you say, with contact tracing, that becomes important not to anonymize, which opens up a whole non-technical bag of worms. So the solution in theory, supports the technology to do what we wanted to do. And then we've got a whole nother discussion on the side, which isn't really Cisco's problem, which is how do you handle that data, right? I'm personally kind of excited in a purely selfish way from the idea of having they discussed the open interface side of this with of APIs, so they can talk on the radio side, from the protocol side, they can talk like Zigbee and had the BLE support, so that they can actually talk to IoT and numerous IoT devices and act as effectively a proxy hub for that stuff, and get beacons from all the devices and return all that stuff elsewhere, so that I don't have to have 1,001 third-party hub devices potentially sitting in my buildings, and manage all of those other devices. And conceptually, as that capability builds out and other vendors start providing, if they I don't say buy in, and I don't necessarily mean money-wise, but if they adopt that API and start providing specifications saying, can you add this command, that command, add this, I like the idea that we could start moving towards having a common API where you can start getting beacons, you can start requesting commands and start actually having a shared infrastructure for IoT devices, because I think that's something that would hugely benefit the IoT world and is missing right now.
Absolutely, I think you're right on that, and I think it's important to bring up that they mentioned specifically BLE and they mentioned specifically Zigbee, but they actually called it an 802.15.4 radio, right? So what that opens up, if you actually look at a lot of the IoT protocols, many of those are built off of 15.4. So what that implies is that they will be able to build connectors for for those other protocols. Really, anything the one not gotcha, but the one caveat there is it does have to be a 2.4 gig radio. So anything in the 415, 800, 900 megahertz space really doesn't apply. My one concern there is what we're going to see a whole lot of enterprise and commercial grade equipment end up in 2.4 gigahertz that's already crowded, right? 10 years from now, when 6E is a reality and we've got all of our devices, pretty much that are being deployed on the network are 6 gigahertz capable, that may not be a big deal. We may think of 2.4 gig the same way we think of 900 megahertz space now, right? But at least in the meantime, I think what we're going to see is a lot more clients available in that space. That space is going to become even more unusable for Wi-Fi. That's a whole other rant and aside. With that said, the fact that you could get to build a single wireless network, and the fact that we have the right tools for doing the surveying and the predictive design and the troubleshooting and we can capture packets, for 15.4. We've got spectrum analysis for 2.4 gigahertz. That means that we have a really well-developed tool set for supporting that space already. And when you consider that by designing for 5 gig and designing for 2.4 gig, you're also designing your overlay, your IoT sensor and actuator overlay network. That is pretty compelling, and it's a great use of that technology, and I'm really excited to kind of see how that matures.
This is where bringing it all central makes a lot of sense, because some of the ethical components of that, you want to have all that data in one place and not distributed all over the place. So bringing it all together makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it also simplifies a lot of your kind of network design and access there as well, right? 15.4, almost all of it 6LoWPAN, right? And so the question then becomes, well, are your by making the access point the gateway, you don't have to worry about 6LoWPAN or IPv6 necessarily in your LAN if you're not already using it, right? So there's some design considerations and there's some security considerations there by also doing it that way, even beyond just simply bringing everything into that single access layer and single kind of pane of glass for management.
All right, I think we've gotten a pretty good discussion here of some of the technologies that Cisco's leading with intent-based networking, both from a technology perspective and from a social perspective of how it needs to integrate together in order to make us more functional. But I want to take a quick moment just to ask all of the roundtable participants. We've seen intent-based networking transform itself quite a bit over the last, 3 or 4 years, from a buzzword into some kind of thing that really makes sense. Where do we see this going forward? Where do we see intent-based networking carrying us, 2 years into the future? Jody, I want to start with you.
Going to be interesting to see. It's like I mentioned earlier, where everything is becoming far more lightweight on the on-premises, moving to data center, in some cases cloud in other senses. This needs to be a lot more modular, and it needs to be brought down to a much more lightweight footprint in order for this to get general adoption. It's great for the big guys right now, but 90% of the industry are the little guys. They're going to want to see some of this. Right now they can't, but Cisco has a way of refining things. As things get refined, they'll shrink down, it'll get embedded in stuff. We'll see a lot more distribution, and I think it's a good direction.
Shala, what about you? Where do you see all this technology headed in a couple of years?
The way I see it, for one, of course, it's an exciting time. And then, I don't know, I just see it about like getting better at being able to see exactly what is on your network, but being able to do it quickly and not, I guess I'm coming from a standpoint for where there's been times where I needed to figure out what was sucking up a ton of bandwidth. And I had to go and talk to a bunch of different people until I figured out that someone had on their computer where they had their Ring cameras running. And I was just like, it's you. And so I want to get to a point where I can quickly see, okay, what's this device first off? Where's it located at? Like, is it even like physically here somewhere? And can I like go straight to it and be like, hey, this is what's causing the issue, and correct it. So
it's interesting. John, what about you?
I think what I'm kind of picking from, especially from what we were presented, really is the integration of information. It's, and I guess what I'm seeing from this then is going forward is an extension of that, right? Which is an even smoother and even more detailed availability and integration of information, of identification of devices and of what they're doing, to the point where you really can use that in terms of the intent on the network, but without having to actually, manually dig into it. Just the different aspects you can pull in of what a device is, where it's coming from, where it's going to, what its purpose is, and so on, without having to pull together information from 7 different systems, but actually being able to unify all of that. And I think being able to pull all that stuff together going forward and seeing all that stuff integrated, I guess what I'm saying is I see that becoming easier. I'd like to see that across the industry, right?
Well,
yeah, I'd like to see that everywhere, and to Jody's point, I mean, not just at the top end, but throughout the product range, right?
Yeah,
that's because we like it easier everywhere. Please.
Exactly.
JD, what about you? Where do you see all this headed in the next couple of years?
Well, one of the demonstrations that really sticks out in my mind was the ability to grant access for, essentially everyone has their own, micro network, right, of their devices, and being able to grant access into your network from another user. What I see is I see that probably being more heavily defined or refined, so that I can not only grant Tom access into my network, but I can grant Tom access into my printer only, and during these hours, and kind of that specificity, yeah, very specifically, in a way that provides me the ability to control things, right, as a user, not as a network engineer. And I think the more that we can push that type of control into our users' hands, we are going to see happier users, right? Because they no longer, we can provide that kind of per user security boundary, but by giving them that access, we also keep them from having to contact support every time it's, well, my roommate at a college, or my coworker or whatever needs access to this device, right? So it simplifies the support scenario from a technical perspective. It simplifies it from a user perspective, And the more refined and that experience becomes, I'm pretty positive. I have a really positive outlook when I think about that in a couple of years.
You're right. That was a good demo. That was a fun demo.
Yeah. Phil, what about you? Where do you see all this headed?
So I have a 2, maybe 3-part answer, so bear with me. In a Cisco context, we're going to keep it down to 2-3 years. I agree with Jody that this is a hard sell to a small, medium business. And I know how some vendors look at business size. A medium business might still be thousands and thousands of people. It's a hard sell because it does require hardware rip and replace. It requires new controls. It requires the implementation of sophisticated technology. It's not just throwing, Cisco Prime into the mix, which, is relatively easy and there's not too much of a learning curve. And so that being said, I think in the next couple of years, so short term, okay, that's what you asked about, 2 years, we're going to see more proliferation of DNA center with assurance, right? And just limiting it to that without the entire, SDA fabric, we're going to see people starting to adopt the 9800 controller as they phase out their older controllers. We're going to start to see people ditch CMX for DNA spaces. That's what's in the immediate future. I do not necessarily see a wholesale, everybody is going to do a rip and replace of their entire network, get everything going, full fabric, full IBN across the board, integrated with SD-WAN. A lot of this stuff is still maturing. Now, industry-wide, where do I see this going in the next 2 years? We're going to see more of a focus on that analytics piece that several people said. And that's important because when you start to integrate a lot of these network abstractions, when you start to integrate a lot of these technologies, by default, you're getting that benefit of the analytics, the visibility, whether you want it or not, I guess. And there it is, and it's very valuable. So I think you're going to see vendors say, look at this very important and meaningful information. How can we sell this, right? How can we package this better? And we're going to continue to see that develop and grow, and that'll get integrated into the different single panes of glass, pardon my French, and all of that. Now, industry-wide long-term is autonomous remediation, which we haven't discussed yet. But that is the end goal. That's the goalpost in, 7 years. I don't know what the years is on that. We're not there yet. That's still pie in the sky kind of stuff. But the long term is, oh no, I have an ISIS adjacency or a BGP adjacency that's down or something that's flapping, and the network corrects itself. There's an application running poorly, and the network corrects itself. We're not quite there yet. Somebody mentioned trust issues. So that's the way I see the long term of IBN industry wide. Well, that was the second half, and then the first half was the short term in a more specifically Cisco context.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for this. This was a fascinating look into kind of how the community sees some of the announcements that have been coming out and the technology behind it. And I think we're all kind of on the same page that we want this to make our lives easier. We want this to be better for all networkers of all cuts of cloth, whether it's from the small engineer to a big cog in an IT team. But ultimately, that's the goal of technology, is to make our lives easier. And if that's one thing you took away from Chuck Robbins' keynote, it's that technology needs to support the mission that we're trying to accomplish. Being techie for the sake of being techie isn't going to cut it anymore. I'd like to thank our delegates for being a part of this roundtable today, and I'd like to thank them for their participation in the Cisco Live sessions. If you'd like to learn more about Tech Field Day Virtual Cisco Live experience, please head over to our website at techfieldday.com and check out the videos that were recorded during that session. If you'd like to see more great roundtable discussions and other content like this, please head over to our website at gestaltit.com to find more.